The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Expanding into International Amazon Marketplaces, EU to EU versus EU to US, with Rachel Greer, Cynthia Stine, and Jeff Cohen. Today is day one of a two-part webinar that we're doing. So today we're going to focus on EU to EU, and tomorrow will be EU to US. My name is Corey Checketts. I work at Seller Labs. I do marketing. Jeff will not be available to attend the webinar today, but Cynthia and Rachel are available to present and answer your questions at the end. Just so everyone knows that this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a recording out after the two-day event is complete. So a little bit about Seller Labs. We are a software company based in Athens, Georgia in the United States, and we have three different applications currently. Feedback Genius is probably one that most people are familiar with. It automates messages to generate product reviews and seller feedback. We have support in 8 different Amazon marketplaces. We have a variety of features that'll help you review, monitor your product reviews, and you can send custom messages and receive all sorts of great notifications about positive and negative feedback. Snapshot is a tool that a lot of sellers use to increase conversions and generate product reviews. As well, it's a great platform to promote new products and to launch new products that you have, and it's compliant with Amazon's terms of service. And Scope is soon to be released. It's our Amazon product research tool. It helps you understand what your competition's selling. It helps you understand the fees associated with selling and sourcing a product, as well as knowing the best price and doing keyword research as well. The presenters today are Rachel Greer and Cynthia Stine, and Rachel has more than 7 years of Amazon experience. She worked at Amazon where she managed audits, product testing, and inspections. She founded Cascadia Seller Solutions in 2015. She and her team help consult small to medium-sized businesses who need help protecting and building their brands on Amazon. And Cynthia is an entrepreneur with more than 25 years of experience, either selling, consulting companies, launching products and different services, as well as helping sellers and companies survive crisis situations. She's a best-selling author of suspension prevention, and she also blogs about all things at her website, onlinesalesstepbystep.com. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Cynthia.
Okay, thank you, Corey. Basically, what I'm going to talk about today is how to stay out of trouble with Amazon when selling in the new markets. So we have a lot of clients that are based in Europe, and we've seen them get in trouble when they step out of their own marketplace. And so this is kind of where my focus is going to be, because my focus is suspension prevention. So I want to help sellers avoid getting suspended in the first place and help them understand how Amazon looks at their business so they can avoid just making some mistakes, right? And so that's what I want to talk about today. If you could move the slide there, Corey. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about in terms of suspension, I wanted to let you know that the U.S. is ahead of the EU in terms of the algorithm and suspensions. So things that are happening in the U.S. today to my sellers will be happening overseas, in a few months. So they basically kind of roll. This is our experience. Rachel could probably tell you more about what they actually do, but our experience from having lived through this is that they come and they roll things out in the U.S. and then later they go and roll them out in the other countries as well. And so when I talk about things that I see or problems that we're having, some of them in the U.S. right now, you can be assured that they're coming your way. Okay, so they may not be stopping people for doing some of this stuff now, but they will be. And what happened basically last spring was there was a major change to the algorithm to improve product quality on the U.S. platform. So what they were trying to do And they've done it successfully. So what they were doing was basically trying to get products off the platform that were less than perfect. Maybe they were ugly, dirty, scratched. They, there may have been a lot of reasons why they were not the perfect product that Amazon likes to sell. And so all of a sudden, a bunch of sellers were getting suspended for things that they've never been held accountable for before. And they were shocked, okay, because there was no warning. Amazon didn't send out an email saying, hey, guess what, guys, you've got about a month to clean up your act because we're going to put out this algorithm change and here's what it means. And there's no humans involved. And I say that because the information gathering is all done by algorithm, or I like robots because you can visualize a robot. And so this information is all based on the algorithm. Oops, not yet. It's all based on the algorithm, and then the information is then brought to someone who works in seller performance, and then they send you an email, and they say, you know what, here's the ASINs that are examples of what we're talking about. That's what they do when they suspend them. So the people involved only become involved when it's time to send you the email, and they're not looking at your account at that time. Like, they're not sitting there doing an analysis of your account. They are basically saying, oh, this is the data that's been brought to me. I'm going to paste it into this email. I'm going to send it to you. So the only time somebody actually really looks at your situation is when you respond to the suspension notice. So that's why I say, this is all kind of being done by robots, and, no humans involved, because there isn't anyone who pays attention until after you send in your plan of action. And this is how suspensions work over there as well. Like, no one's going to look at it until you turn in your plan. There's no metrics for product quality. So we all know what our dashboard looks like in Seller Central, the green, the hundreds. There are no metrics. There's no dashboard for product quality. So people were genuinely surprised, and they had no clue that they were in trouble until they were suspended. So part of what I try to do is to help sellers understand what Amazon is looking at and where they're getting these crazy ideas about product quality inside their accounts, because this change on Amazon's part is not your fault. As a seller, you are responsible. So, now it's been a year since that major tweak, and I tell you, they probably tweak that algorithm a little bit every week. Or at least it feels like that to us, because we start to get these waves of suspensions, and they're all pretty much the same, right? So it's like all of a sudden for a week we'll get a bunch of guys who sell fine jewelry suspended, all for the same reason. Or another week we'll get a bunch of guys, I say guys, but sellers who are selling or who are getting suspended for abusing their product review programs. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. So there are definitely waves. There are definitely things that they're kind of trying to fix on the platform, and they don't give you any help or instructions. So basically, that's what happened, and this is also hitting all the other marketplaces as well. So that's one thing that you will need to know, whether you're going into the EU or to the US, is you'll need to really pay attention to why people are returning your product, because that's where the secret is. That's where the information is that you need. Okay, next slide. So here's some common suspension reasons. So Amazon tries to make it really easy for you to expand from the UK to Germany, or within the EU, they try to make it really easy. And if you're a fairly high volume seller, they're soliciting you big time. Oh, come on over to Spain. They want you to sell in every marketplace, and so some sellers take them up on that, right? But again, they're not necessarily telling you the things that you need to know to be successful. So where I see people getting suspended when they're trying to move into a new market in Europe is Amazon's shipping requirements is one of them. It's a big one. And like in the UK, they don't like to use tracking data. Or as one seller said to me, nobody uses tracking data with the Royal Mail. And I said to him, Amazon does, right? And so they get into trouble because packages get lost, they can't track them. And, you know, Amazon really wants us to run our accounts in other countries the way they run them in the US in this sense. They want tracking data, they want fast delivery, and they just try to think of every possible way they can, you know, improve the customer experience. And so where I also see people getting in trouble is with customs. So maybe they're, you know, shipping stuff into Germany, for example, and it's getting caught up in customs, and then the buyer has to go to Germany customs, which charges by the day for storage, and pick up their item. So by the time they get their item, they're really pissed off. And so one of the things I would tell you as a seller is to be really aware of the requirements for each country in terms of shipping if you're going to be shipping yourself. Now, for a lot of my clients, I really encourage them to do FBA because then it's Amazon's problem to get the product to the buyer. But if you're going to fulfill yourself, that is one thing you cannot screw up because, you know, if that country requires that you have a customs form that goes with the package, you better make sure you have that customs form with the package. I can't tell you how many sellers I've seen who don't do that. So really understand each country's requirements for, you know, bringing product into the country. The other thing you have to be aware of are products that are forbidden in the new market. So every country in the EU has certain regulations they all follow, right? And then they each have their own quirks and eccentricities. And I mean, just like your power plug will be different in each country pretty much, you can count on lots of other things being different in each country. So you can't just automatically say, oh, this is a great product selling here in the UK, let's sell it in Germany. And so the first thing I would do is if you're, and I know Rachel's going to touch on this more, but if you're going to sell a product into a new market, make sure you're allowed to. If it's an electrical product, there's going to be a lot of regulations around it. If it's a food product, lots of regulations around it. If it involves chemicals, plastics, I mean, just about any product you can think of. If it goes on your body, you know, there may be different rules in the country that you want to bring it into. So the first thing I would do before picking a product to sell in the new market is make sure you're allowed to sell it in that market. Another place that sellers get in trouble is with inauthentic goods. So, you know, basically inauthentic means that the product may be legitimate and may not be, but the place where you bought it from is not authorized. This happens a lot in Europe. You may buy a product in Spain to resell in Italy, and they will consider that inauthentic because the version that was made for Spain is not allowed to be sold in Italy. So that's called the gray market, basically, and Amazon is really clamping down on the gray market both in the US and overseas. And so that's another thing, is just be aware that you'll need to provide proof of your product all the way back to the manufacturer and that it is legitimate to sell it, again, in this country that you're going into. So it's not that it's a fake product, it's just that you may not have permission to sell it in that country. And of course, there's a lot of legal implications, trademarks, copyrights, IP patents, and so that's, you know, another thing. And again, I know Rachel's going to talk about it more, but this is another area where sellers can get in trouble is by trampling over somebody's intellectual property when they move into a new market. And again, if you're buying it from an authentic source and you have the right to sell it in that market, you're not usually going to have legal problems. So just keep that in mind. Different standards of customer service. So Amazon itself is probably the world's leading expert on customer service. And they do a very good job of it. That's why people love Amazon. And they hold us to the same standards. And so if you're going to be going into a new market and you're going to be dealing with buyers there, you need to make sure your customer service scripts are translated into the language that you're selling in. I can't tell you how many times I've seen where people don't bother to do that. And then they get unhappy buyers because, you know, they don't know what they're getting, right? They're expected to know English. And, you know, there are some countries they find that very offensive. So that's the other thing too, is make sure you have some good customer service scripts, very friendly, and that they're translated into the language that you're selling in. You know, another reason why sellers get in trouble when they move into a new market is they don't understand their buyer. I had a client who was selling spiky dog collars in the UK, and I mean, these are the kind that hurt the dog. It's not a decorative thing. This is like it pokes spikes into the dog. And it's illegal in the UK. And they have more vegans per square foot in the UK than anywhere else in the world. They are not going to allow products that are cruel to animals on their platform. I mean, it just takes a moment of thought to realize that. But if you don't know that, if you're not at all aware of where you're moving into, you can make that kind of mistake, which my client did. And they had so many restricted products that they uploaded to the UK platform that they were suspended. So you really be aware of who your buyer is in that marketplace and what they want to buy. Don't just upload somebody's catalog. Okay, that's just a bad idea. Manipulation of the platform. This is again where the seller will maybe do product review programs or something like that in the new marketplace, and they won't really understand the rules. So I see this a lot. Amazon has been really cracking down here in the US on product review companies, and they've been doing it somewhat in the UK and the EU, but those it's still behind in the EU. They're not being pursued as vigorously. There's still some very bad practices that are going on with these product review companies overseas. And I'm just telling people right now, their time is coming. They are living on borrowed time. Amazon is going to come after them just like they did in the US. So again, really be aware if you're going to do something like product review programs, that you're using a program that is compliant with the US rules with the Amazon rules in the US, because frankly, otherwise you're just asking for trouble. And then of course product quality. So this is what I talked about earlier, where the product just isn't perfect. So they're selling, imperfect product. It's bumpy, it's ugly, it's dirty, it's dusty. Maybe they bought it liquidation, and now they're selling it in another country, and buyers are returning it. Next slide. So basically, what is product quality? And these are some of the terms that you'll see when Amazon is suspending you for product quality. And so it's not necessarily what you think. I mean, damaged is pretty obvious, but you sold as new. I have buyers that tell me all the time, but my product is brand new. And I try to tell them it's in the mind of the buyer. It's not the reality. And so these are the terms that need to become a part of your everyday life when you're looking at your returns from whatever country you're selling in, your own country and the new countries. Next slide. And this is just me. So if anyone is, this is obviously what I deal with is suspension prevention. And anyone who's interested in my book, it is selling in the UK. And if you want to know more about if you do get suspended or you have questions, you can reach me at Online Sales Step by Step or suspensionprevention.com, and we can help you. So that's it.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was great. Next up, we have Rachel Greer, and she is going to talk to us about expanding internationally from the European Union to European Union. It's all yours, Rachel.
Okay, great. Thank you. So next slide. So who exactly are we, and why do we have any authority to speak on the subject? I worked as a law enforcement liaison for Amazon DE from 2007 to 2010. So I'm pretty familiar with the European marketplace and the rules that govern it. And law enforcement liaison role was in the TRMS department, which is the same team that houses buyer fraud, seller performance. After that, I managed recalls and safety for North America, then managed Amazon Basics, which is Amazon's global brand from 2012 to 2014, managed the compliance for that, and I managed global imports and was responsible for the relaunch of Amazon's EU imports program in 2014 until I left in 2015. Our firm is made up entirely of former Amazonians. Jennifer managed trade compliance. Trade compliance is the logistical piece of moving something from one place to another, so the compliance of the shipment, making sure the proper customs paperwork, the proper weight, the proper shipping, bill of lading, all the paperwork. And then you can see what the rest of the group was experienced with at Amazon. And the basic premise of our firm and what we do is that as former Amazonians who worked on Amazon Basics and other Amazon brands, that we understand what it takes to build and grow a brand on Amazon and in global markets. Okay, so what I want to talk about today are the most common pitfalls that sellers run into. We are primarily focused on brand owners. So if you're reselling, the main concern is if you are also importing, regulatory compliance is applicable if you're importing, but for the most part, this is primarily applicable to brand owners. The 5 most common pitfalls we see are not clearly spelling out your supplier agreement and purchase order, not clearly defining your brand identity and sourcing on that identity. I'm not going to talk very much about that one on this presentation, but basically what that means is defining whether you want to build a high quality product or a middle of the line product, or whether you're just trying to sell based on cost. You need to find the right factory to fit that. Not evaluating the total profitability. So you need to calculate in the duties and freight, returns volume, packaging costs, compliance costs. Not checking for regulatory compliance, and not checking for quality control and quality assurance. So when I'm talking about supplier agreements, I'm specifically referring to the contract that you have with your supplier. And I don't suggest making it terribly long, maybe 2 to 3 pages at most, but spell out exactly who is paying you and who is producing the goods for you. Those are usually 2 different things. So who you pay versus who's actually, which factory it is that's actually producing it. Try to make sure that the invoice is in Amazon's format, so the requirements for invoices for product quality. We find that PL sellers often have difficulty with getting Chinese invoices accepted without some sort of customs documentation as well. But the other thing that needs to be clarified are the payment terms for samples, for tooling costs. We find that costs can start increasing significantly if you don't tell someone up front that they're going to the EU. And you tell them, oh yeah, so this product is being sold in the EU, and they're like, but wait, I've got to now source EU compliant packaging. That's going to cost you twice as much. So that can be a rather unpleasant surprise. So as far as the Code of Business Conduct and infringement, the issue there is that the difference between each marketplace is every country gets to set their own laws, right? So sorry for any background noise anyone's hearing. So in terms of setting the expectations for you as a company going into that country, you need to know how infringement laws are enforced. How is intellectual property enforced? How do you sign up for a trademark? How do you sign up for a copyright? Can you protect your patent? In the US, at least, it's really simple for how you protect your intellectual property, but you have to register it. Same things for Europe. Just because you're registered in one place doesn't mean you're automatically covered in another. I know that sounds somewhat of a simplistic thing to say, but it does seem to be a surprise for some people. Okay, so purchase orders. Next slide. So this is where it's really important to define exactly what you're purchasing and exactly where it's going to and what your expectations are. Include the product testing protocol that you expect it to meet, include your inspection checklist, whether you want to have exclusive rights or whatever you've agreed on with that supplier, and your expectations for packaging. Packaging is a lot more important than a lot of people realize. Cynthia was talking about the issue of used, sold as new, and inauthentic being a buyer perception issue. And for private label sellers, that's almost entirely because they're relying on the Chinese seller's packaging, which is usually pretty much garbage. If a nice item arrives inside of a really damaged, smashed up box or inside of a cheap poly bag, the customer is not going to have a good experience. It's very important to make sure that your packaging is solid. Okay. Next. So your total landed cost is comprised of multiple different pieces. So your duties, make sure you work with someone who actually understands customs in wherever you're importing into. So depending on which country you're importing into, you may have different expectations. Obviously, importing into the EU is one thing, but what we've found when importing into the EU when I was at Amazon is that importing into different countries had different results. Depending on where you were going, regulations were enforced more or less heavily. Make sure that you're calculating your freight costs. It may make more sense to do ocean freight or even overland rail freight, depending on where you're sourcing from. Always structure your returns, because you don't want to argue with customers about returns. The number one issue that we see for people getting suspended in all marketplaces is ticked off customers. So if you allow your customer to get ticked off at you and then they file a report to Amazon, either negative feedback or submitting a return and writing a nastygram in the return, which you don't get to see, but Amazon does, or actually just filing a report to Amazon, which you can also do as a customer. You can just report somebody. Make sure that customer, and then of course if you're merchant fulfilled, then they can file an A to Z claim, but make sure that customer isn't unhappy. It's better to lose the money than to deal with Amazon trying to correct your bad behavior in their perception. So for packaging, the increase in packaging is usually between 3 cents and 10 cents a unit. It really depends on the product. It can be up to 50 cents depending on the quality of the packaging you need, but always build in additional packaging costs into your landed cost, because the built-in packaging is never going to be good enough. For compliance, this is the most important piece in my mind for the EU that people do miss. When we were first importing into France, the concern that I had was that the French customs officials would be stopping the items on the border, and this was based on a lot of information that's in the marketplace about how French customs officials review imports, and they have a lot of employees to do so, probably about 3 times as many as the US has, and a lot fewer ports to monitor as well. And that's exactly what happened. So if you're going into French ports, depending on what you're bringing in, anything that's subject to EN 71, which is the Toy Safety Directive, anything subject to the Low Voltage Directive, probably not ROS and REACH, but anything that has a specific directive attached to it, you can expect someone will ask you for that documentation going into France if you're filing through customs. What we found was that the UK, Germany, and France were pretty much on parity in terms of what they asked for, but there were certain local differences. So in the UK, we saw a lot more questions about upholstered products, stuffed products, plugs, car seats. In Germany, we saw a lot more questions about leather and sustainable claims. So if someone said it was made of wood, they were a lot more careful about making sure that it met the EU illegal timber regulations. And then, of course, in France, they asked for everything. So that was lovely. Okay, next. So for regulatory compliance in the EU, the biggest issue is anything for toys or articles with perceived play value for children is regulated by EN 71. 71 is a very detailed, in-depth toy safety standard, and it's the most in-depth standard in the world, both in terms of chemical safety and in terms of quality and performance. Quality and performance is pretty similar to the US standard. That meets the US standard okay. The US standard is also pretty strict. But in terms of chemical requirements, the EU standard is much safer than any other standards. So you do want to make sure that if you're importing anything that could be considered a toy or be for a baby, anything that is considered play value that can be mouthed by a small child, and for the EU, children are considered 13 and under. The goal here is to make sure that you don't even get asked for anything, but if you do get asked, you need to make sure that your documentation has been provided from a third-party accredited lab within the last 2 years. In the US, it's within the last year, but in Europe, we found that customs officials will accept within the past 2 years. For the Low Voltage Directive, this governs all electrical and electronic products intended for the EU market. This is really about the issue of Europe having such high voltage compared to other markets. So standard voltage in the EU is 220 to 240 volts as compared to 120 volts in the US. So the design of the product actually, in many cases, needs to be different to meet EU safety standards. So I could have a product in the US let's just use a hairdryer, for example, something with a pretty significantly sized motor and wires the motor can blow out if something happens with the electricity current. So you have a product in the US that's perfectly safe, that is not a problem at all for 120 volts. You plug it into the wall in the EU and the motor burns out within about maybe 5-10 seconds because the voltage is so high, the wiring can't handle it. So products actually need to be designed to meet the low voltage directive. It's very rare, in my experience, that something in the US is actually able to meet the requirements for being able to be sold in the EU. If someone produced something just for the US. In fact, for Amazon Basics, we actually had a process of creating items for the US, Japan, China, and India, and then we would create products for the EU, just in terms of design, materials. The EU is so much more expensive, it just wasn't worth doing a global product because it's harder to make products for the EU. So you should also keep that in mind if you're doing sourcing in the gray market, as Cynthia mentioned. Make sure it's actually a product intended for the EU because it might not be actually safe to sell, which could be a really big problem in terms of customer perceived value. ROS and REACH are chemicals requirements. ROS applies to components in electrical circuitry, so you'll often see Alibaba suppliers with something as ROS compliant. That may or may not be true, but they'll say that, and it's a requirement for basically not poisoning the water table in local areas. So you want to make sure that you're using compliant products so that someone doesn't toss it out and then it leaks into the water table and then poisons the land and water. So that's really what ROS is about. And then REACH is I believe it's over 170 chemicals now. It's quite a lot, but it's a regulation that says that if you're going to import any one of these substances of very high concern, SPHCs, into the EU, then you need to either register as an importer of this chemical and pay the fine for importing something that's of very high concern, or you shouldn't be importing it. It's obviously much easier to just not import it. Registering is not a fun process. Working with EU regulators isn't a fun process. It's a very slow-going process, so just not doing it is the best process. But again, this comes back to the same issue with EN71. Europe has much stricter chemical regulations than pretty much anywhere else in the world except China on paper. And the concern, of course, is you need to be able to meet those if you're importing. Otherwise, if someone investigates you, if a regulator investigates you, which is somewhat rare, but it can happen if you've already got something stuck at the port and they start asking you more questions, the burden of proof is on you, actually. They don't have to prove that it's unsafe. You have to prove that it's safe. So having the test report is just a lot easier than not. And then for UK-specific issues, what we see there is the UK has a car seat evaluation program, so Amazon will actually check all car seats that are listed on the website and boot off and warn sellers who sell non-compliant car seats. Obviously, plugs are an issue. Same thing there. There's a program to evaluate plugs that aren't intended for the UK and then warn and boot off sellers who do it enough. Supplements, the laws in the US and the UK are very different. Most supplements in the US that wouldn't be regulated by the FDA are in fact regulated in the UK. And then the UK has different regulations than each of the other countries. Supplements are one of the worst categories to be in terms of actually being compliant. And then the UK also has a very unique law about anything that's stuffed and upholstered, primarily couches, pillows, baby cribs, strollers, anything where there is something where someone sleeps or sits where there's a fuel load. And their expectation is that that product is safe from both a smoldering cigarette and from an open flame, which is the most difficult flammability standard to meet. Most flammability standards in the world are either smoldering cigarette or open flame, not both. So there's a lot of products that are actually compliant just for the UK marketplace and nowhere else. Obviously, it's more compliant because you can sell it anywhere else in the world, but there are products that are just intended for the UK and then products that are intended for the EU. So just because a product is sold in Germany and it's a pillow or a stuffed item or a mattress or a comforter does not actually mean it's compliant to sell in the UK. The UK has very strict standards on this, and they do enforce it. They have regulatory enforcers just for this particular law. Okay, next. So quality control are your inspections, and the inspections are typically 309 a man day in China, and we do highly recommend getting inspections. As Cynthia mentioned, customer perception is everything when it comes to product quality, not actual product quality. So if you have smudges and scratches on the product itself and the customer opens it and there's smudges and scratches, or a grease stain if it's some sort of tool or home improvement product, or it's got a dirt smudge on it, or in some way the colors don't match, say they have a different dial on the front or the back of the shirt, you're going to have a problem with your customer perception, and that's something that you obviously do not want to have. It's a lot cheaper to pay for an inspection and get the information and fix it with the factory in China than it is to sell it at the point of destination, have Amazon ask you about it, and then pay Cynthia or I to help you work through that. We're a lot more expensive than an inspection. So the prevention is worth a pound of cure adage is pretty accurate here. The other thing I want to mention on inspections is make sure you understand what you're actually asking for and ask for help if you need it. But AQLs are not percentages, they're a statistical likelihood. So if you have an AQL of 2.5 and 4.0 for major or minor issues, and zero critical, of course, that doesn't mean 2.5 or 4.5%. That means that 97.5% of the time, this situation will happen, which is different than 97.5% of your products. So in any given batch, you could have up to a 6 to 12% defect rate for major and minor combined. Doesn't mean that it's a total of 2.5 or 4%. So what I recommend for Amazon is actually 0.65 and 1.0, which actually equals out to around 2 to 3% defect rate. And by defects, I mean all defects, because Amazon customers are so picky. If you have smudges or scratches, which are normally a minor issue, they'll complain. So it's important to make sure that you set your checklist appropriately and that you do the inspection work for Amazon specifically, not just what's standard in the industry. Okay, next. So quality assurance refers to laboratory testing, not related to regulatory compliance. The General Product Safety Directive outlines the specific requirements to be safe. So in some cases, there are not directives about a specific product, or there are many directives in the EU. There may not be specific directives about a particular product, but the GPSD says that if you're the importer, you need to make sure that the item is safe, which means that you may still be held responsible if something isn't safe if there is a voluntary standard. So do your due diligence, make sure you understand what you're bringing in before you bring it in. If the product safety team at Amazon gets a customer complaint that says the product is unsafe, they will ask you for your documentation. If you have none, then you don't get your ASIN back. It's that simple. Product safety usually doesn't take down accounts, but they will definitely take down ASINs, and they're very strict about what they expect to get from you in terms of proof of compliance. For quality, there are multiple independent trade association standards out there, but of course it's an association full of many different companies, many different people, and they're going to go to the lowest common denominator. If you're just producing a standard middle-of-the-line product, that's probably fine. If you're producing something that you're going to charge a little more than average for, you want to make sure that your product actually exceeds those quality standards so you can get good reviews. Okay. So what does this mean on Amazon? First, if you don't do your due diligence, you're going to get a higher volume of returns. This increases your costs and can impact customers if a returned item goes back out to that customer. Overall, unhappy customers, you want to make sure that your product is good, that you're following up on your product, that you know what's required for the EU. And we actually got complaints from customers about saying that our item was FSC certified, the Forestry Stewardship Council, which is an independent organization that certifies products as not being on the list for EU illegal timber. And customers are looking for this. So if you're going to import wooden products into the EU, I highly suggest understanding what the FSC is about and making sure that your products are FSC compliant. Same thing with packaging. If you are sourcing your own product and putting your own packaging on it, source FSC compliant corrugate, because customers in Europe, especially in Germany, actually contact customer service to ask about FSC compliant goods. Poor packaging results in damaged product customer complaints. You don't want youthful, those new issues. If you're sourcing FSC compliant corrugate, you're probably going to be fine. You can probably throw that thing against the wall and it's not going to hurt the product inside. Make sure your product is branded And this also really helps for import and customs, as unbranded products often can be seen as potentially counterfeit, and there are customs holds on those until you prove that it's actually yours. So definitely brand your product. A lot of small sellers slip through and get by just fine until they're of a certain size. As soon as you're successful, a lot of these things are A, more likely because you're importing more and a lot more quantity, but B, is a bigger problem for you because you have more to lose. So it's important to make sure that your I's are dotted and T's are crossed there. And then, of course, if you are infringing on someone's IP in the UK or other parts of the EU, do your due diligence, research, make sure that someone else doesn't have the intellectual property rights to whatever you're selling. Okay. So we help sellers with contracting with reputable third-party accredited labs. We do not work with any of the small inspection companies like Trigo, and there's a couple others there that charge between 100 and 150 a day. The problem is they're not paying their inspectors enough. That's not market rate for inspectors in China. This means that inspectors are going to supplement their income in some other way, either through bribes from the factory will bribe them proactively, or through blackmail to the factory by saying they're not going to release the shipment until they get their bribe. So we do not work at all with these smaller companies. There are certainly plenty of them that have good inspectors. It's just because of what they're paid, it's much more likely for them to be susceptible to bribery. So we only work with third-party accredited labs. This costs about $309 depending on the location. If it's inland China, obviously it's more because someone has to fly there. And then of course Europe and US sourced products are more expensive. And then we offer consulting services to help create testing protocols, understand customs, understand how to write detail pages. We also have agreements with translation companies we use, packaging companies we use. But basically what we do is try to help our sellers build a product that is compliant to EU standards, compliant to Amazon expectations, and basically doing the whole process the same way that we did it when we were doing Amazon Basics, which is actually quite successful in the EU. And our website is www.thinkcascadia.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a lot of great information. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience learned just as much. So we have about 15 or so minutes before at the top of the hour. We're going to go over some questions that we received earlier when people registered for the webinar. So the first question that I have for you, Rachel, is from Andreas, and he wants to know about requirements on labeling of children's clothing. I guess that's for you.
Okay, so children's clothing is an item that, technically speaking, isn't regulated in the EU. So it really depends on how you define the regulation. The GPSD basically requires that everything be safe. And so what we did from a risk perspective at Amazon was just define children's clothing the same way that the US does, and just define it as a children's product and test it as such. So for labeling in the EU, you do need to have the same 4 requirements that you have in the US, which is country of origin, the name or number of the manufacturer or importer, the care instructions, and in the EU you can use symbols. So there's specific symbols, Gentex symbols that you can use. You're not allowed to use the Gentex symbols unless you're registered with Gentex, which can cost a little bit. So you may just prefer to write it out in each language. You do need to write it out in each language. It has to be locally labeled. This is the reason why in Europe you see giant long tags, or you go to IKEA and you see giant long tags, because you do have to label it in every language or register with Gentex, and Gentex is expensive, so labels are cheaper. And then the last piece is fiber labeling. So your fiber labeling has to be accurate. And the trick about fiber labeling is every country defines their own list for what fiber labeling consists of. So in the US, FTC regulates that, and there's certain words you can't use, certain spellings you have to use. Same thing in Europe, so you need to double check that. And then in Spain, there's a somewhat unique requirement for labeling in that they want you to put your VAT ID on the label as well if you're importing it. And what I also recommend for children's products in general is a best practice from the US, which is to put a tracking label on the label as well, or somewhere else on the garment, so that if the neck label is taken off, then at least the tracking label will remain like somewhere on the side seam But a tracking label is basically a label that allows you to trace that product back directly to the factory that made it during the time period that it was made. And this really helps for any sort of customer inquiries if there was some sort of failure or someone investigated your product and found the button failed for lead, or especially for infant clothing. Infant clothing is actually treated as a toy. So shoes, infant shoes need to be tested as toys. Any sort of decals or attachments have to be tested to the toy standard to make sure that they're safe. So making sure that you have a tracking label on there helps you to follow up and follow up with the factory and get the information to your customers so that they know which tracking labels are affected. You don't want, if you're doing this for a long time, if you're selling for 6-7 years, for example, the last thing you want to do is have to recall every single thing you ever sold. It's much easier to do by a lot and then only recall a lot that was a problem. So that's the basic requirement plus recommendations for children's product labeling.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. That was a very thorough answer. We appreciate that. Next question I have is from Amy, and this one goes to Cynthia, and her question is, do you know of any recommended services for translating listings?
Sure, and I bet Rachel does too. I work with Akorbi, A-K-O-R-B-I, and they are worldwide. They translate all over the world, and I find they do a highly accurate job. And what's nice is if they've already translated a word or a phrase for you once, they don't keep charging you for it. So if you use a similar, let's say you use a phrase, in all of your shampoo products or something, and it's the same one, you're not paying the translator to translate that phrase over and over and over again. You're only paying them for translating the new stuff. So they keep a library of everything they've ever translated for you, and you only get charged once. So I've used them for many years, even before I was selling on Amazon.
Oh, and can you give that URL again?
Akorbi, A-K-O-R-B-I .com.
Awesome, thank you. So this next question we got was from Latif. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I hope I am. Sorry if I butchered your name. But the question, and this is for either of you if you can answer, is there a report in business reports which gives the returns information?
Yes, I guess I'll take that one. There's actually several reports. So the first report that you look at is the imperfect orders report. And you'll find that on the page with your dashboard. It's below the perfect orders. So it's on the lower right-hand side. It's a hard report to find. But the imperfect orders report tells you where there's been returns or other problems with an ASIN. I usually sort it by ASIN and look at any ASINs that are kind of gathering problems to see if it's something I can fix. And then there are specific returns reports in Seller Central as well, under reports. And so if you're merchant fulfilling, there'll be a merchant fulfilled report for returns. And if you're FBA, it'll be under FBA, and there'll be an FBA report. So some of my clients who do both have both kinds of reports. And again, what I usually do is I'll sort it by ASIN. I'll look for the ones where I've got 3 or more in the past 60 days of returns, and just look and see what kind of returns they are. So there's normal returns, change my mind, doesn't match my couch, doesn't fit, whatever. Those are normal retail returns. And then there's the ones I call the negative returns. And those are the ones that are generally product quality reasons, or they're, some other really negative reason that Amazon might choose to suspend your listing or your account for. So it's those that I showed you earlier, used sold as new, not as described, not as advertised. All those negative reasons, those are the ones we pay really close attention to, because Amazon does not look at them as a percentage of sales. They look at defective as a percentage of sales overall, but they don't look at these product quality as a percentage of sales. They look at them as absolute values. So you may be selling, 1,000 of these a month, and maybe you've got, 3 or 4 returns for, you know, inauthentic or counterfeit or used, sold as new, and they'll shut down your listing because it's a problem that they see that needs to be addressed right now. They're not looking at it as a percentage. They're looking at it as you only get so many of these types of returns before we shut you down. And we really wish they would tell us exactly how many of those we get. That's part of the secret algorithm black box. But we are very conservative with our clients, and we tell them if you have 3 or more negative returns on an ASIN in 60 days, you should really investigate and see if you can fix the problem. You might even need to shut down sales on that ASIN until you've figured it out and can fix the problem.
Okay, thank you
And
so much.
Cynthia, just to piggyback on that, the biggest issue that I see with this is that they really built this based on the Amazon's and-on-cord process. So the and-on-cord process is used, it's based on the Toyota concept of if a worker on the line sees a problem, anyone's allowed to pull the and-on-cord and stop all of production until the issue is corrected. The idea originally is for a customer service rep who gets a customer complaint. If they see a problem, they can immediately pull the and-on-cord on the product, stop selling it, take it down until the issue is fixed. So what that meant for the retail team is that if a customer called into customer service and said, I ordered a 2-pack, but what I got was a single, I don't understand what's going on, then the customer service rep was authorized to pull the and-on-cord. In the cases of not as described, which is what I just described there, with where it says 2-pack on the listing, but they only got 1 item, that's considered a not as described issue. They would take down the listing the first time that happened. Same thing with sales on safety issues. So if a customer called in and said, this was a really big problem for me, my son used it and he's 3 and he fell because it made him trip or something, like some sort of safety issue, then customer service is trained to immediately shut down that product until it can be investigated. This also happens with packaging issues, but packaging issues are less common. So with packaging issues, you'd probably have 3 or 4 issues before something gets shut down. So packaging, and what I mean by that is if a customer complains, this arrived shattered in the box, or this arrived in 2 pieces, or when I opened it, it was smashed in on one side. You know, many different ways that packaging was insufficient for the product. We see this the most often with breakable items. Breakable items constantly were getting shut down with and-on-cords. So the concern that I have with this whole process is not that it's not good, because it is. It is good to use your customers' feedback and to improve your product. The problem that I see with it is that FBA sellers don't get the return reasons. They don't get those notes from the buyer. So if you're a merchant fulfilled seller, you get those notes, and the buyer is telling you, yeah, this thing was a piece of crap, I'm never buying it again, and I hate you. You know, they're really specific, and you can tell exactly what's going on. Or they might say something like, just okay, didn't like it. You know, but you get exactly what the customer was saying, and you know what their issue was. The SBA report only gives you the disposition code. It doesn't give you those notes from the buyer. And without those notes, you're basically flying blind. And that's the biggest frustration here, is you need to basically predict what kind of issue your customer is having. Are they having a safety issue? Are they claiming it's counterfeit? Are they claiming that it's damaged? Because the words that are used by the product quality team are not actually often the problem. They're just kind of throwing things at you. So you have to figure out what the actual issue is. So follow up with your customers regularly. Track all the feedback you get in your seller feedback and your product feedback any way that you can to figure out what the issue might be, whether it's because it's a packaging damage situation, and so then 3 or 4 items have occurred, and so they've now decided that you're selling used, sold as new items. That's their only way of describing that. Or is it a safety or a counterfeit issue, in which case you only need to get one of those, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the not as described reason code. We've seen it happen in defective and damaged as well. And you only get one of those before they take it down. So that's one of the more frustrating aspects about working with Amazon right now. That I have complained multiple times, so we'll see if anything actually happens. But if you want reason codes, this is something to write in and ask about. Ask seller support for reason codes. If you want it, then ask for it, because the more complaints that sellers have about this, the more likely it is that it'll actually change. You need the reason codes to properly solve the problem. Without those reason codes, you don't know what's going on. It is very opaque, as Cynthia explained earlier.
Yeah, that's right. And I was just going to say, I've complained officially too because I'm a seller as well. So yeah, we've complained. Not that I think it's done anything, but the other thing I would say is what we do for all of our clients. We have a maintenance service for all of our clients, a suspension prevention monthly service to help them stay on top of their accounts. And so one of the things that we do for them is we will email all of their negative returns, and we'll ask the buyer, can you, we'll say, we're really sorry that your experience with us was less than perfect. Can you tell us what we could have done better? Or something like that. Just keep it real open-ended and see what they say. And then we gather this information and we kind of keep it in spreadsheets so that if we start to see patterns on ASIN, then we'll be like, oh, okay, now we see what's going on, right? But yeah, you have to take that extra step and do it yourself because they're not giving you the information. And then also what's equally frustrating is, of course, a lot of people won't respond. I mean, they don't have to, right? And so it helps, but it's not the solution. The real solution would be if Amazon gave us the reasons.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Those were really great answers. We're here at the top of the hour, so I think we'll squeeze in one more question. Uh, and then also, just so everyone knows, we'll also do a follow-up Q&A blog post to answer more of your questions. So don't worry if your question didn't get answered. We're going to get to them. Okay, last question is from Monowar, and he asked, do I have to register my brand to each country for legal issues, as well as registering my own brand in Amazon? And I think, Rachel, that one was directed at you.
Yeah, so each marketplace is separate. So Amazon actually runs what they call stacks. So there's a North America stack, there's an EU stack, there's a China stack, and there's a Far East stack. India is part of Europe, and Japan is the only thing in the Far East. It doesn't make any sense, but that's how it's run. So if you're going into different stacks, then you have to re-register everything. Your accounts can't go over. Part of the reason why you can't have a unified account between the US and the EU, everything is separate. So the requirement there is to register your brand in the EU. As far as the actual legal requirements for registering your brand outside of Amazon, then you would want to contact either a company that helps do that or a qualified lawyer in the EU to help with that. But you are required to register for brand registry separately in the EU and in the US or anywhere else you go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. We might be able to squeeze one more in. What do you think?
Sure.
Okay, let's see here. Looking through a couple of these questions. Okay, that's actually probably a good question for tomorrow. And again, we're going to be speaking about selling in the U.S. tomorrow. So I know there's a few questions about the U.S., but we'll cover those tomorrow. So last question here is from George, and he asked, you mentioned supplements were subject to stricter and special laws in the UK. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the major difference between the US and the UK in terms of supplement regulations is that the FDA doesn't regulate most supplements. So basically, if you say that your item doesn't cure anything and that it doesn't do anything and that all it is a, it's just vitamin C, whatever, then the FDA doesn't actually regulate that pretty much at all. So the difference between that and the UK is that the UK does regulate it. So you do have to make sure that your ingredients are registered. You do have to make sure that your claims and your labeling are accurate. There are some ingredients that are banned in the EU that are not a problem in the US, similar going back and forth. So basically, if you're bringing a supplement in from the US to UK, the likelihood of it actually being compliant is fairly low unless it's something just like vitamin C. That's it. If it's something that's a little bit more complicated, that has a few more items, ingredients of a different chemical makeup in it, you may be required to register that ingredient, or it may be a long process to verify that it's actually safe for human consumption. But the UK actually treats dietary supplements, they treat other kinds of drugs, which the US doesn't do. So it's a lot easier to launch a dietary supplement in the US.
And I'll just add that the Amazon algorithm is looking for sort of trigger keywords. So Like in the US, it can be ridiculous. I had bath salts taken down because it was apparently making health claims. And I'm like, it's salt. I mean, ingredient, salt. So anyway, it was, I got it back up. But that's the other thing too. It had said something about increases circulation, in the bathtub. So this was like a health claim. So that's the other thing too. When you think about, moving from one market to another, is what each market considers a health claim could be really different. So and it's going to be run by an algorithm. So just be very careful in creating your listings as well. And then, like Rachel said, obviously in the UK, everything is looked at much more closely than in the US in terms of supplements. And every ingredient matters. But if you want to sell bath salt in the US, don't make health claims.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cynthia and Rachel. That was some great information. Again, we'll be sending out the replay after the webinars are done, as well as a question and answer blog, which will probably be out within a week or two. So look forward to that. And we'll be back tomorrow at the same time. That was 1700 London time and noon Eastern Standard Time or Daylight Savings Time rather, in the United States. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.